So good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Bloomingdale Neighborhood History Group Zoom presentation about notable New Yorkers of the Manhattan's Upper West Side, Bloomingdale, and Morningside Heights. That's my book that came out 2.5 years ago. And I'm going to do a little bit of an update to the book, which I hope people find interesting. But first of all, again, welcome on behalf of the Bloomingdale Neighborhood History Group. There's 15 of us that do these presentations and maintain a library of local history and law in the Bloomingdale branch of the public library on 100th Street. And we also do monthly tours of the neighborhood. And we also send out a quarterly news blast that has a lot of interesting and offbeat and uncommon history of our neighborhood here. So if you go to our website, upperwestsidehistory.org, I'll remind you of that in a minute, you can get onto our list, and we don't share your name or address with anybody, but we'll make sure that 4 times a year you'll get our newsletter, and you'll see some interesting stuff. So we've got some interesting stuff coming up on February 12th, the Monday night, at the Bloomingdale Branch Library. We've got a presentation about the infamous Old Community. This is the community that gave us Billie Holiday and a whole bunch of other notable African Americans. And the presentation is called An Island in Bloomingdale, Life in the Old Community. It's going to be presented by Susan Freedy, who has a lot of personal experience with the old community and the people that still get together some almost 70 years later after the community got decimated by urban renewal back in 1954, 1955. So again, that's Monday, February 12th. On February 22nd, a Thursday, we've got a presentation called The Lost Theaters of Broadway, an Upper West Side story presented by the great Gary Dennis. Gary is the expert in the city on old theaters and a lot of movie history. And that'll be a free Zoom presentation at 6:30, as is this one. We've got other stuff in the works. I don't want to go too far in the future, but on April 3rd, we've got a Zoom presentation by Robert Rodriguez, a renowned photographer. He's presenting a program, Stories of the Stones, and the stones being the stones of the Cathedral of St. John the Divine. And you'll be dazzled by the photographs he has of parts of the cathedral that you would never, ever see with Robert's eyes. That'll be pretty good. And sometime after that, one of our members, Suzanne Ray, and myself will do a presentation on Jauncey Lane, this old abandoned lane between 91st and 92nd Street that has some very interesting history. For the moment, though, if you go into the Bloomingdale Branch Library on 100th Street between Columbus and Amsterdam Avenue, you'll see an exhibit that's there through the end of February called The Old Community, How a Black Neighborhood in Bloomingdale Began, Flourished for half a century, and then was abruptly destroyed. It's a fascinating exhibit. It's a number of panels with some photos, images, and text that is very uncommon. Not much is written about the old community, so we've got that there. And then, as I mentioned just previously, we have free walking tours of historic Bloomingdale. They all start from Strauss Park, the south end, meaning the 106th Street side, but you'll have no problem finding the tour leader because there's usually a crowd of people there to begin the tour. And the next one is February 4th. It's coming Sunday at 2 p.m. I usually host them, but this time we've got a special treat. Rob Garbo, one of our members, is going to do it with a new breath of fresh air. The next one after that is March 10th, et cetera. So let me show you. I'm going to start to share the screen now to show you a few things that we're going to get into. So here's my book, and let me go backwards. Let me go forwards. To emphasize again, our website is upperwestsidehistory.org. You'll find all sorts of interesting stuff there. One of my favorites is a PDF that if you click on it, you'll get a spreadsheet of every building between 96th Street and 110th Street. And it lists the architect and the date the building was constructed. but it's got all sorts of other interesting stuff. One of our other members, Pam Tice, does a lot of our blog pieces about Little Coney Island and some other institutions that most people are just not all that familiar with. So, but here's my book, and you'll notice I've got an arrow to the upper right-hand corner, because I used to joke with people that if you could tell me the names of all the people on the cover of my book, there's 10 people there, I would buy you dinner. Well, I've changed the arrangement. Now you get a box of macaroons. But I'm going to give away the person on the upper right-hand corner. On the upper left-hand corner, I think you could recognize Billie Holiday. Lower right-hand corner, Maya Angelou. Lower left-hand corner is Amelia Earhart. And I think you could recognize some of the other people. In the upper right-hand corner, she's the tough one. She's Julia Marlowe. And I call attention to her because for years we thought she lived in the River Mansion, which is that mansion-type building on 106th and Riverside Drive. It's technically 337. But my good friends, Dan Waken and Gil Tauber in our group, with a fair amount of research and detective work, figured out she did not live there. She actually lived at 335 Riverside Drive. So anyhow, in my book, you could read all about her. These are two people that I'll tell you, I wanted to get into my book, and I did, but it really went down to the wire. I couldn't satisfy myself that Carole King really lived in 390 Riverside Drive, but I finally did satisfy myself. And I had a similar problem with Nina Simone, which required some detective work. So anyhow, long story short, they're in the book. You won't have any problem finding them. And they are just spectacular people. Here's a fellow that should have been in the book. Earl Lewis and his group, the Channels, they had the fifth most popular record in all of 1956. And 1956 was like the big start of rock and roll as we know it. Their song being the fifth was on Wynn's radio. Alan Freed determined it was the fifth most popular that year in terms of airplay and listening and records sold and stuff. Number 4 was Why Do Fools Fall in Love by Frankie Lyman and the Teenagers. Number 3 was The Platters, My Prayer. Number 2 was Elvis Presley's Don't Be Cruel. And number 1 was Five Satins in the Still of the Night. So you could see the company this group was in. They actually formed in the neighborhood. They won a talent contest up at the Apollo Theater. And then the rest, as they say, is history. About 5, 6, or maybe 7 years ago, we did a presentation for a Bloomingdale neighborhood history group in the old youth hostel building, historic building. Pam Tice can tell you all about it. And Jim Terrain gave the presentation. I moderated him. And surprise, surprise, Earl Lewis showed up and was in the audience and acknowledged us and acknowledged that he lived on 98th Street. And we were just thrilled that he was there because his song was, again, a giant hit 60 years ago. And I happen to know he's still singing and doing quite well. So I put this out there because I've been so inspired by my first book that I'm working on a second book. I'm about 75, 80% complete on content, notable New Yorkers of Harlem. And there's a lot of overlap between our neighborhood and Harlem. And they're not just African Americans, they're Jewish, they're educational, they're academic, all sorts of interesting people that'll surprise you when the book comes out, but we're not there yet. So here's some people that are not in the book, but I think we've blogged them around. So those of you that signed up for the quarterly newspaper probably got the biography of Milt Gabler, and you could see he lived his final years in the Jewish Home and Hospital. I'll tell you how significant Milt Gabler is. In 1955, he produced the rock and roll anthem, Rock Around the Clock. It was done on West 70th Street in the Knights of Pythian Temple, which got turned into apartment buildings. A couple of famous people that came out of there. But that's where Decca Records recorded Rock Around the Clock in 1954, and it was produced by Milt Gabler. He also produced an extremely historic recording in 1939, Billie Holiday singing Strange Fruit, which is an image of the lynching that went on in this country back in those days. An extremely important recording, and Billie Holiday is just incredible with it. A few years later, 1942, he did a recording of Flying Home that had Lionel Hampton, Illinois Jacquet, Charlie Christian, a couple of jazz greats at the time. And rock and roll aficionados sometimes think that that Flying Home is the first song that has all the elements of what we might call modern rock and roll. But you be the judge. Milt Gabler got into the record business by working at his uncle's record store, Commodore Music Shop, which specialized with jazz records on West 42nd Street. He set up a new store then on 52nd Street, which is then known as Swing Street because of all the jazz performances there. And then he soon established Commodore Records, where he reissued a lot of jazz recordings. And started emphasizing the names of individual jazz artists. His nephew was the comedian Billy Crystal. Billy Crystal actually worked in the store quite a bit. So anyhow, we have Milt Gabler. I'll show you another giant now, and here too, I think we've had this fella in one of our quarterly newsletters. The great Benny King, the Ed Sullivan Show and their orchestra. And when John F. Kennedy had his famous birthday party in the old Madison Square Garden on 8th Avenue and 50th Street, Hank Jones was the gentleman who conducted the orchestra there. That's the famous one where Marilyn Monroe comes out of the cake and sings "Happy Birthday to You, Mr. President." But we're talking about Benny King. One of his big hits in 1961 was Spanish Harlem, which was co-written by the infamous Phil Spector. Another big hit in 1961, which has almost become a rock anthem, is Stand By Me, the movie of that name employs the music, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And that song, Stand By Me, is extensively used in film soundtracks, recorded by more than 400 artists, from Otis Redding even to John Lennon does a nice version. Benny King was also the lead singer of the rock and roll group The Drifters in 1959 and 1969, when he's singing "There Goes My Baby" and "Save the Last Dance for Me." Those were mega hits from those 2 years. The original Drifters formed in 1953, had a number of hits that spouted rock and roll star Clyde McPhatter. But Benny King was born Benjamin Earl Solomon in North Carolina. He came to Harlem as a 7-year-old with his family, sang in a church choir, then doo-wop groups, and then finally one of the groups, the Five Crowns, got reformed into the Drifters, and the rest, as they say, is history. And while we're on music history, another giant, Mario Bauza, one of our Bloomingdale neighborhood members, Angel Roman, is advocating for a plaque for Mario Bauza on Columbus Avenue. He is an absolute giant in the realm of jazz, Latin, and Afro-Cuban jazz music. But I can't do justice to what the New York Times wrote about him. They say, without Mr. Bauza, a short, garrulous man, American music would be radically different from what it is today. Trained in both Afro-Cuban music and jazz, he helped introduce Latin music to the United States, first deeply influencing jazz, then popular music, and later rock and roll. As the band leader of Machito and the African Cubans, based at the Palladium, 53rd Street and Broadway in Manhattan, he helped introduce a series of dance crazes from the cha-cha to the mambo to the rumba. And Mr. Bauza stage managed the arrival of two of the United States' most important musical icons, Ella Fitzgerald, whom he discovered at the Apollo Theater in Harlem and brought into the band under band leader Chick Webb, and Dizzy Gillespie, who Bauza introduced to Cab Calloway and put in his orchestra. So he's just an amazingly influential musical artist. And along with Angel, I support the effort to have a plaque in his name at 944 Columbus Avenue. How about this woman I discovered? She only passed away 2.5 short years ago. Lila Fenwick. You may never hear this name again. 317 West 108th Street. That's the block where what's his name? Victor Herbert lived. James O'Gorman, the only senator who lived in our neighborhood. But Lillian Hellman, Lila Fenwick was the first Black female graduate of Harvard University's law school. That's why she's so significant. She's a Barnard undergraduate, and she also lived up in the Bronx, but her final years were at 317 West 108th Street. And I jumped the gun a little bit with Lillian Hellman. Here's a wonderful photo of her in her early years. I thought I knew much about Lillian Hellman, mostly from the 1979 movie, which played up her feud with Mary McCarthy, with Jane Fonda played Lillian Hellman. I thought I knew quite a bit about her, but again, my friend Angel introduced me to a book called The Broadcast 41, which is about 41 women who got given a hard time by the House Un-American Activities Committee, all blacklisted women that had never been kind of put together in one place before. And this book, The Broadcast 41 by Carol Stabile, does exactly that. Another remarkable woman who lived in our neighborhood was Melba Tolliver. Some of us will remember her from reporting the news. She received national attention in 1971 when she refused to wear a scarf or a wig to cover up her Afro-style hair when she covered the wedding of President Richard Nixon's daughter, Tricia. But in 1967, Tolliver became the first African-American woman to anchor a network news program. She was born in Ohio, graduated with honors from the Bellevue School of Nursing. While working as a nurse, she pursued interest in acting and dancing and did a few commercials. But while working as a secretary at ABC Television, she did a brief fill-in during an AFSTA strike. And when the strike was over, she was encouraged to get journalism training at NYU. And then ABC fast-tracked her in their training program. And soon enough, she's a reporter and a news anchor that did programs from 1967 to 1976. She also co-hosted an African-American community series called Like It Is with Gil Noble, who was a step along the way with NBC News, and a similar stint with a Long Island station. Tolliver taught at the University of Michigan, was a writer in residence at Pratt Institute, awarded an honorary degree at Malloy College out on Long Island, and lived in our neighborhood here at 467 Central Park West. These next two people I should have had in my book, but I was lazy. I knew they lived on 109th Street. The male of the two was born in Newark, and then lived, I think, in the West 90s for a while, and then became prominent. I went to Columbia and then became prominent as a writer. I still don't have their address on 109th Street. I've got to pursue this, but I'm concentrating on my Harlem book of notables. But let me show you whom I'm talking about. Siri Hutzfeld and Paul Auster. And Siri Hutzfeld was born in Minnesota, graduated summa cum laude, Phi Beta Kappa with a BA in history from St. Olaf College in Minnesota. She taught Norwegian language and literature there as the first professor of those studies. And then she went on to get her doctorate in English at Columbia. Her dissertation was on Charles Dickens, and that reflects her deeper interest in aesthetics, ethics, and epistemology, because indeed she started writing essays as well as fiction. Her first novel, Blindfold, in 1992, portended others of critical acclaim, especially What I Loved and The Sorrows of an American. Her range of nonfiction and extensive lecturing has drawn much attention to the visual arts, especially painting and artists. In 2012, she was awarded an honorary doctorate from the University of Oslo. And she's married to Paul Auster, the other gentleman there. And Auster should be well known in Morningside Heights neighborhood for all of his books. The first thing I read by Auster was the New York Trilogy, where in one of the books, if I remember correctly, there's a map of the neighborhood that shows where the character walked down certain streets and then up a different street. It was kind of my kind of street level book and whatnot, but he went on to write much more things and more profound stuff. He wrote, I don't know if you remember, his book Music of Chance made it into a movie in 1993. He also wrote the screenplay for the 1995 movie Smoke. He wrote Moon Palace. I remember reading that, which was about an Asian restaurant right here on Broadway at about 113th Street. So the two of them are giant writers. They now live in Park Slope. And soon enough, I'll find the exact address where they lived in our neighborhood. The next person also should have been in my book. I came upon her in researching for my Harlem book, but she's a giant, and that's Eartha Kitt. There's some wonderful images of Eartha having a cat-like persona, and indeed she's used as Catwoman, so that this picture has her in the Batman movie. Diana Ross credits her sound and look to Eartha Cook. No surprise there. Her early records, Stacey Bone, Cole Porter's Love for Sale, and Santa Baby, which is a perennial classic, express her persona. If you listen to how she sings, great impact on Janet Jackson, even Connie Francis, and certainly Madonna. Her Catwoman in the 60s television series Batman was over the top with her evil implied sassiness. It was one of the great castings on television for all time. She came to New York after she graduated from school down in South Carolina. And then up here, she continued at the School for Performing Arts, sang, danced, acted on Broadway. She was in Orson Welles' 1950 production, Helen of Troy. And Dr. Faustus. I remember taking a record out of the New York Philharmonic Library about 40 years ago called New Faces of 1952. That was written, the show was written by Mel Brooks and Sheldon Harnick, and it featured Eartha Kitt as a new uprising star, along with Carol Lawrence as a new uprising star, Ronnie Graham, if you remember him, Paul Lynde, and a few others. So anyhow, we're fortunate to have her in our neighborhood. She was in various motion pictures like St. Louis Blues, Anna LaCasta, could be seen in many other television. She was on the Ed Sullivan Show, like I think 15 times. At a White House luncheon, Lady Bird Johnson supposedly was brought to tears after Eartha Kitt gave an honest insight about the Vietnam War protesters that pointed out, quote, "We raise children and then send them to war." So she will be remembered for much, including that. So before I go to the next person I found that should have been in my book, but absolutely wasn't, I want to do a shout out for the fella who did a fabulous YouTube on the building where this next notable lived. And the fellow who did the YouTube is Tom Fedoric. If you YouTube 345 Riverside Drive, or maybe Tom Fedoric, you'll get the YouTube. His wife, Lizzie, did the PowerPoint presentation. So I give them both tremendous credit. It's a great example of a local building discovering its history. And if you know 345 Riverside Drive, it's not a sexy building, but Tom explains why it's not. And he, in doing that, he just makes a fabulous presentation on YouTube. So anyhow, and I've noticed as I walk around the neighborhood, especially West End Avenue, there are more and more buildings that are putting historic photos of their buildings in the lobby. And oftentimes it's groups of photos, and some buildings even have their own website, which usually touches upon their history. But here's the address, and here's the star. He's the father of Angelina Jolie, John Voight. Now, John Voight, most of us know because John acted, probably his breakthrough role was in Midnight Cowboy. He was also in Deliverance. In Coming Home, the 1978 movie, he won the Academy Award for Best Actor. He's extensively employed in streaming and all sorts of series that are made everywhere. He's just an actor in great demand. He's got a look. I think he's very reliable and a great actor and whatnot. Nearby 345 Riverside Drive is my building, 370 Riverside Drive. We just installed a plaque to Hannah Arendt. It's on the outside of our building. I often talk informally with people that stop to read the plaque. But there's people in my building that are talking about a possible plaque for this woman, a good friend of ours who just passed away. And that's why I noted her last date is December 31st, 2002-3. There's actually a memorial service at the Schomburg Center for her this Sunday, which we'll be attending. She lived in my building, 370 Riverside Drive, and also on West 94th Street. June Jackson Christmas grew up in Cambridge, Massachusetts, right by Harvard. She got a undergraduate degree from Vassar in zoology. She then got a medical degree in psychiatry from Boston University School of Medicine. She then did all sorts of things. She was chief of group therapy program at Harlem Hospital, founded Harlem Hospital's Rehabilitation Center in 1964. She served as the principal investigator on research projects for the National Institute of Mental Health, from 1964 to 1972. 1971, she began teaching at Columbia University's College of Physicians and Surgeons. In 1972, she was appointed by Mayor John Lindsay to become the deputy chief of New York City Department of Mental Health and Retardation Services, reappointed by Mayor Beam, reappointed by Mayor Koch after that. In 1980, she began teaching behavioral science at City College Medical School. She's the first African-American president of the American Public Health Association, which she became in 1980. And in 2003, she became a member of the board of the Jackie Robinson Foundation. In fact, was a long-standing friend of so many notable African-Americans, especially Rachel Robinson, Jackie Robinson's widow. So another person I discovered, and I'm not sure I would have put him in my book, but he's interesting. And it's funny, when we tour the neighborhood, I often give some attention to fire escapes because sometimes they call them the love balconies of, you think of Romeo and Juliet, where they love scenes on the balcony. And you can think of certain movies like On the Waterfront, where Marlon Brando was in a love scene on the fire escape. But fire escapes are much more than that, but they're certainly kind of unique to New York City, along with stoops and precious few other things. And so this next notable is the Reverend John M. Carden, a Jesuit, who is the basis for the priest played by Carl Malden in On the Waterfront. In the lower left-hand corner is Carl Malden with Marlon Brando. Some of his famous quotes, I could have been a contender and stuff like that. But anyhow, Father Corrigan lived right here in our neighborhood on Amsterdam Avenue. The next person I'm going to is a giant and not yet fully appreciated because he hasn't passed away yet. He's 90 years old, 90 plus. And I actually I'll tell you, when I put my book together, I went down to about 94th Street. And then I started discovering some really important people on 93rd Street. So I extended it down to 93rd Street. The northern end, including Morningside Heights, went up to 125th Street. I also wanted to get William Fox in my book. He's the namesake of 20th Century Fox, Fox Television, all of that stuff. He really had nothing to do with television because he died in the 1930s. He had not much to do with 20th Century Fox. He actually filed for bankruptcy in 1930. He was pretty much out of the movie business. But anyhow, I wanted to get him into my book, and he lived on West 92nd Street, close to Riverside Drive. So I went down to 92nd Street. And this next fella, as I found out recently, also lived on West 92nd Street. And that's Quincy Jones. He played trumpet in his early years. Actually played with Lionel Hampton for a while, with Dizzy Gillespie. He was so good. He was so talented with his musical abilities to arrange, compose, put the right orchestrations together and whatnot, that he started working for numerous people, and he actually did arrangements for Ella Fitzgerald, Frank Sinatra, Sarah Vaughan, numerous others. He did film scores for The Pawnbroker, In Cold Blood, In the Heat of the Night, and a whole bunch of other movies. It's a little tidbit. Leslie Gore, if you remember that name, from 1963. Her first hit was It's My Party, but her subsequent songs were all hits as well. And they were a little more complex than the traditional rock and roll songs from the late 50s, early 60s. Well, anyhow, all of that stuff was produced by Quincy Jones. And he kept doing that. He kept arranging and producing and whatnot. And he finally produces 3 albums for Michael Jackson. And depending on who you talk to or what you read, one of the albums, Thriller, gave us the hits Beat It and Billie Jean. And Beat It might be the most recorded song of all time. It used to be simple to say it was Bing Crosby's White Christmas. And then when rock came in, the numbers in the late 60s and early started going through the roof. So anyhow, you be the judge, but Quincy Jones is associated with a lot of that stuff. He provided a lot of counsel to the development of Motown as well. How about this fella, Edward Teller, 88 Morningside Drive. Most of his career centered around Chicago. In fact, out there, he co-founded the renowned Lawrence Livermore National Laboratory, probably the premier country science laboratory. He was a member of the Manhattan Project. In fact, Teller is often called the father of the H-bomb. He gave negative testimony against Robert Oppenheimer. So that became a thing, and the scientific community kind of ostracized him. But anyhow, he lived in our neighborhood when he had some Columbia and Manhattan Project related connections. The next person I'm more pleasantly surprised to show you, because I think he's one of the greatest writers living today, and that's Colson Whitehead. Although Brooklyn can now claim him, he grew up in our Bloomingdale neighborhood. He won 2 Pulitzer Prizes, one for his novel, The Underground Railroad, and the other for The Nickel Boys. His John Henry days, which I read, had also, if it had won, it was nominated. If it had won, he would be the only person that won 3 Pulitzers for fiction. But anyhow, John Henry days did not win. It was a finalist for sure. His most recent novel is a real treat. I've read that too, Harlem Shuffle. I highly recommend that as a good read. All of his 8 novels have received awards. They earned him a MacArthur Fellowship, Guggenheim Fellowship, Harvard Arts Medal, Library of Congress Prize for American Fiction. He also wrote 2 nonfiction books, numerous articles. He still writes for the New Yorker, occasionally for the New York Times. and any other publication that's fortunate enough to have his talents. He attended Trinity School. He graduated from Harvard in 1991. When he's not writing, he teaches at NYU, Columbia, Princeton, other universities. Vassar College and the Universities of Richmond and Wyoming had him as a writer in residence. I'm surprised that we haven't seen a movie made of one of his many spectacular novels. But anyhow, we're indeed very fortunate to be able to claim some time with Colson Whitehead in our neighborhood. Another woman in my findings who you might remember, I haven't written up a whole lot of detail about her. Again, I'm concentrating on my Harlem Notables book, but Lenora Fulani, she ran for president in 1988 on the New Alliance Party, lived on West End Avenue, had very progressive liberal leanings, to be sure. So she was in the news quite a bit, and significant part of history. So the next person in history I show you with trepidation, because he's not a good guy, I'll put it that way for starters, but the way in which I came by him is interesting. I'm a slow, long distance runner. In my later years, I have to run every day, but I run very slowly, and my distances are not as great as they used to be. So at my country place upstate, I was running 4 miles in the morning on a rail trail, the Harlem Valley Rail Trail, if anybody knows that, near Taconic State Park. And I thought I'd try podcasting, and my wife recommended a particular podcast and helped me with the technology of putting earphones and setting my cell phone on in such a way to start listening to podcasts. And when I listened to this, my first podcast, I couldn't stop running. So this is how much I acclaimed this particular podcast. And that podcast was Rachel Maddow's Ultra. And I am sure some of you have listened to Ultra. Ultra is about Nazi infiltration of the United States right up to the level of senator just before Pearl Harbor. And it's a compelling story, and she does a magnificent job with the story. She did a follow-up podcast on Spiro Agnew, which is also very, very compelling. But anyhow, the principal character in Ultra, that podcast by Rachel Maddow, is this fella, George Viereck. So as soon as I heard his name and all the nasty stuff about it, I had to find out where the heck he lived. And indeed, he lived right in our neighborhood. I found the first 2 addresses, and my friend Pam Tyson, our group, read the book about by Rachel Maddow about Viereck, and that site's 305 Riverside Drive. More than un-American, Viereck was an anti-Semite, a Nazi agent. He was indicted a few weeks before the actual attack on Pearl Harbor, when the United States entered the war. His activities with prison time and related details recounted in Maddow's podcast cost him his marriage and whatever he owned, because his wife liquidated their holdings and donated their funds to Jewish and Catholic charities. Although he supposedly mellowed after exiting prison in 1947, he maintained neo-fascist connections. He was born in Germany, no surprise there. But what is surprising is the early part of his life. He wrote poetry he graduated from City College in New York. His poetry was first published in German-American newspapers, but as early as 1904, published in book form and acclaimed by critics at the time. 2 Columbia students who boarded in his household also touted his talents as a poet and writer in journals. One of them was Leopold Lewison, who would later become a prominent literary critic and who was the brother of the maybe more famous Adolph Lewison. He's the namesake of Columbia's Lewison Hall, and also the namesake of City College's Lewison Stadium, where some of us are old enough to remember going to New York Philharmonic concerts in that Lewiston Stadium, which has been torn down and replaced by a more modern building. So that's George Viereck. I'm sure something will materialize around his life in the streaming world. Next person, very, very significant. I won't give you a lot of detail about him because there's biographies of him and much history, but Morris Ernst, a lawyer. He was on the ACLU board for years and years and years and years, friends with a number of presidents, very close to FDR. He then ingratiated himself with Harry S. Truman, but he was also friends with Louis Brandeis, Groucho Marx, Grandma Moses, had a wide social set of very, very interesting people. He'll go down in history. I think behind the scenes, he had a lot to do with the 33 and 34 SEC Acts, which almost defined modern securities and banking institutions. But he'll go down in history for having won the famous Ulysses case. That's the Supreme Court ruling in 1937 that allowed Ulysses to not be blacklisted by the U.S. postal system. It's a whole story unto itself. But so another really pleasant person I'm very proud to show you, George C. Wolfe, playwright, director, actor. He was head of public theater from 1993 to 2004. That was some of their tough years. Of course, a number of shows went from public theater right to Broadway, and you would think that would help make them successful. But it's tough running public theater because they did a lot of Shakespeare, uncommon plays, and they can't command Broadway prices. He wrote the book, curiously enough, for Jelly's Last Jam. That was a favorite musical of mine about Jelly Roll Morton. He also won a Tony for, and maybe we'll give him the most credit for this, directing Angels of America, that great play back in the 1990s, as I remember. Another person of interest who lived at 501 West 113th Street, building on the northwest corner of Amsterdam and 113th Street, is Sir Norman Angell, with Sir as a giveaway. He's from the UK. Why is he here? Well, he migrated to the United States for a little while, and I found out a couple of interesting things. Gil, if you're listening in, or any of my other fellow Bloomingdale Neighborhood History Group members, in the same building, 501 West 113th Street, as a child was Gaetan Aiello. When we do walking tours of the neighborhood, we sometimes point out Gaetan Aiello as one of the great architects of apartment buildings in our neighborhood. But Angela is here for a couple of reasons. One, if you've ever seen the classic French movie like L'Inde Illusion, the anti-war movie, that actually took its name from Angel's early book called The Great Illusion. But in 1993, because he advocated against war, and this is coming out of World War I, but he saw certain things brewing, he advocated against war and how nations should cooperate, if only they did. He advocated for that and won the Nobel Peace Prize in 1933. Without doing a whole lot of thinking, President Obama, who has lived in our neighborhood at least two locations, also won the Nobel Peace Prize, and there might be a third or fourth. I'd have to think about it carefully. So let me play games with you. I'll give you this name, I'll give you this address, and I'll tell you that Joseph Cotton, John Garfield, Van Heflin, Alan Jones, Anne Bancroft, and the great opera star Jan Pierce all acted in a show that was written by Tilly Edelstein in 1929. It lasted on radio for years and years and years, and then finally it went to television. And of course, you're all wondering, who the heck is Tilly Edelstein? She's the great Gertrude Berg. Her 1929 radio series was called Rise of the Goldbergs. and she played the lead role of Molly Goldberg. Its success took it into broadcast television. It lasted in television from 49 to 1954, but she was a constant presence on many TV shows. They even reprised her role in a short-lived TV show called Mrs. G Goes to College. She won a Tony Award on Broadway for Best Actress for her performance in a long-forgotten show called The Majority of One. She was born in Harlem. She attended Wadley High School, and Wadley High School is a C.B.J. Snyder school. I'm going to reach around for my C.B.J. Snyder book. This is a book that was done by a woman who did a presentation for us, and she was a friend until she passed away last year of many of our Bloomingdale Neighborhood History Group members. This is a book about Charles B.J. Snyder, who designed over 400 of New York City's public schools, including 3 in our neighborhood. Only 1 survives in our neighborhood, PS 165 on 109th Street. But quickly, some other books from our neighborhood. One of our fellow members wrote this book. This is now The History of Morningside Park and Drive. Stephanie has her own, Heaven on the Hudson. My favorite book for more than a year now, Andrew Alpern. He's written a number of great books, but this one, Posh Portals, features a number of buildings in our neighborhood. So great book to have. Apologize for borrowing all this time for these books. Man with the Sawed-Off Leg, another friend of ours, Dan Waken, who used to write for the New York Times. I think now he does publicity for the the Metropolitan Opera Guild. This is a story about these townhouses. It's actually about a robbery that takes place, the largest robbery in New York City at its time. But it winds up on Riverside Drive between 105th and 106th Street. Excuse me. And then there's the classic, our good friend Peter Salwin, Upper West Side Story. This is still the most comprehensive history of the Upper West Side. But I thank you for letting me toss that stuff in. Let's play another game, another part of the game. See if anybody knows this name. She lived at 480 Central Park West, Margarita Cancino. When she died, she lived further down Central Park West in the San Remo, 146 Central Park West. I'll give you one more clue. I'll give you a picture of her. I don't know if that helps. And now, without wasting much time, here she is. Rita Hayworth lived at 480 Central Park West. Rita had 5 husbands, including a prince, Ali Khan, Pakistani diplomat of Italian and Iranian descent. And she was married for a while to Orson Welles. And I've saved our last notable personality for last. Let me try to talk this one through. Everybody, or most people, know Audrey Munson. Audrey Munson was the model who only started getting enough attention about 15, 20 years ago. She was the model for many famous sculptures in the city. In our neighborhood, she was the model for Augustus Lukeman's sculpture in Strauss Park called Memory. She's also the model for the 2 figures on each side of the Fireman's Memorial on Riverside Drive and 100th Street. She's also the model for the figures in the main memorial down in Columbus Circle. So anyhow, she modeled, I think, for over 100 sculptures in the city and counting. They're still finding others. But there's another woman that should probably start to get a comparable amount of attention, and that is Hetty Anderson. This is Hetty. She lived at 698 Amsterdam Avenue. She definitely modeled for the Sherman Memorial on the lower left-hand side. She's the model for that victory figure in front, the Angel of Victory, and that's Sherman up on the horse. I always found it interesting that Sherman in his final years lived on the same block. He lived on West 71st Street, same block as Jefferson Davis's, Verena Davis, his second wife. But anyhow, that's just a bit of ridiculous Arcania. The other sculptured image on the left side is the civic figure on top of the municipal building, which now is officially known as the David Dinkins Municipal Building. Some people think that Audrey Munson was the model for that. So I haven't delved enough into the detail to figure out what's the more likely correct answer. But Hetty Anderson was a favorite, absolute favorite of Augustus St. Gaudens. And St. Gaudens, of course, worked extensively with the great Stanford White. She modeled for other things. She modeled for the famous $20 gold coin. That's thought by some people to be the most beautiful coin in the world. I remember about 4 years ago, we displayed one of them in the New York Historical Society, where I did some volunteer work. But she also modeled for Edwin Blatchfield's murals in the Library of Congress. If you go to the Library of Congress, you'll see these large murals. If you've ever been to Saratoga Springs, I think most people have been, in the Congress Park there that has a lot of the different springs, there's a statue of Katrina Trask. She's the one who left her house to become the Yaddo Arts colony and whatnot. She and her husband, he made money on, made a fortune on elevated trains throughout the city, and they lived in Brooklyn Heights. But anyhow, Hetty Anderson modeled for that. She modeled for the doors on the Boston Public Library. And Gil, if you're listening in again, you're going to love this one. She modeled for the Rutherford Stuyvesant Memorial in New Jersey, that kind of far off cemetery. And if any of you ever take a tour of the neighborhood and Gil is there, which he is on occasion, ask him about Rutherford Stuyvesant. You'll get some personal story and some fascinating history. So on behalf of all of the members of the Bloomingdale Neighborhood History Group, I thank you for your interest in our local Bloomingdale history. And keep your eyes open for my book, which is at least a year, probably 2 or 3 years off. And I want to show you again, upperwestsidehistory.org. You want to go to this website and you want to sign up and look at it from time to time, make it a favorite, and you'll see some wonderful stuff. Download the buildings, read some of the blogs. But I'll show you the names of the 15 of us that constitute the Bloomingdale Neighborhood History Group. And again, I thank you so much for tuning in and partaking in our wonderful neighborhood history, which just goes on and on and on. If you go to upperwestsidehistory.org, you'll see the details of our future presentations. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Jim.
Thanks, Michael.
All right, so I guess we're at the end of the talk, and we'll be taking any questions from anybody, as well as anybody who wants to, say something or make a comment. You can raise your hand and we can unmute you. Also, feel free to drop anything in the chat.
Yeah. And the gentleman who's speaking, you'll see, is one of our 15 members, Michael Gonzalez.
Oh, would the website be the best place for learning about the Sunday walks? I believe so, consistently, yes.
It usually lists them out for the next few months. Yeah, and every walk is different. If you come on one, we have I would say about a third of the people that come every time. We typically have 10 to 20 people. About a third of them are repeats from earlier walks. We go in different directions. We do different things.
And there's no real need to RSVP. You can just show up on the day of. If there's a cancellation, we'll make sure to let everyone know.
No need to register. Everything we do is free. We just love to show off local history.
All right. I'll give it another minute, but it seems like we have no questions as of yet.
Michael, do you know how many people tuned in to join us?
Around 74, I believe.
Okay, great.
And so this will also be uploaded onto YouTube over tonight and will be available tomorrow morning. And I'll make sure that the link gets sent to the website.
Excellent. Great.
Oh, and just to re-mention again that the next talk will be the February 12th, and it will be both in person and online as well.
And the time is different. It's 5:30 because
Right.
the library closes at 7. Yeah. So again, thank you from Michael, from me, on behalf of all the members of the Bloomingdale Neighborhood History Group. Stay with us. There's a lot of new history to be discovered and to be shared. Thank you. Thank you so much.
Oh, one question, Jim.
Sure.
When Barbara Streisand was appearing on Broadway in Funny Girl, do you know if she lived in the Ardley on Central Park West or Ardsley?
I think she did. I didn't find her in our neighborhood, but I didn't expect to. But I did search our neighborhood. But yeah, she lived in one, maybe 2 locations on Central Park West. Brooklyn famously claims her a whole bunch of places, Eastern Parkway and various other places. She's so beloved, and she pretty much changed the style of American music, the Great American Songbook, as she sings it. She'll go down in history as a giant for sure. I remember they had her when she reopened the Lowe's Flatbush Theater that got refurbished and whatnot. But and of course her memoir is getting a lot of attention, which curiously enough, it's a giant book that she reads herself. Usually books are not read by their authors. But anyhow, so I'm hearing, I haven't read it yet, but I've heard some really good things. But I wish we could claim her, but.
All right. Final call for more questions. If not, then we'll wrap it up. And thank you, Jim, for an amazing talk.
Thank you, Michael. Thank you, everyone. Take care.
Thank you. Thank you, Jim.
Thank you.